At Silicon Expert, we manage and maintain a large, comprehensive database of electronic and electromechanical components, accumulating over 1 billion parts from over 15,000 suppliers. The challenge, of course, is not just to collect the data, but to also ensure that it is accurate and up-to-date. So, Silicon Expert currently employs over 350 engineers specialized in different areas, working to constantly improve coverage, quality, and freshness of this database. So where does this data come from? Well, mostly from the World Wide Web through automated web crawlers and search engines. But other sources include directly contacting suppliers by email and by phone. Another source of data is receiving direct feeds from component manufacturers and component sellers. We currently receive feeds from over 1,000 a supplier. But Silicon Expert themselves are considered a source of data. We generate cross-references between parts and find form-fit-function relationships between them based on their technical specs. We do risk analysis based on shortages and historical events, and we do our own normalized part taxonomies and part descriptions. These four sources of data constitute the raw material that our engineers use to power our different services that Silicon Expert provides, including the technical specs, obsolescence management data, compliance to different regulations, availability and pricing and stock levels, and risk management tools. How do companies make use of Silicon Expert? Well, there are three methods to interface with Silicon Expert. The first method is through the Silicon Expert website, where users can log into the Silicon Expert tool and do part searches and upload bill of materials and manage and do part research manually that way. Another method is through the Silicon Expert APIs, where companies can connect their tools, such as PLM tools and CAD tools, to a Silicon Expert database directly and pull information automatically that way. And the third method is similar to APIs, which is direct data feeds and file exchanges, also meant to integrate multiple different systems from different companies. In this video, we're going to be looking at the Silicon Expert web tools. Silicon Expert Part Search is a set of tools that enable you to find and do research on individual parts, but they also act as the foundation of all other Silicon Expert tools and services. We're going to be talking about the finding part numbers by their part number, finding part numbers by keywords and their descriptions, and finding parts by their technical specifications. This is the Silicon Expert homepage. And the most basic method of finding a part is when you have its original part number. If you're searching for a voltage regulator, for example, you may search for LM317. And as you can see, Silicon Expert recognizes what you're looking for and provides useful suggestions of popular and commonly searched parts. You can either select one of these original parts if it is what you're looking for, but you can also go with your partial part number, which is what we're going to do in this case, and we're going to click on Go. Silicon Expert quickly presents you with all of the relevant results to this search. In this case, almost 400 part numbers that match with LM317. On the left-hand side, you can either filter and narrow down results, or simply use them to give you an idea of the kind of data that you're looking at. If you expand the first box here, you see that this part number comes from 13 different suppliers. The second box shows the number of parts that are RoHS compliant and parts that are not RoHS compliant. In this case, we can click here and we can only look at the parts that are known to be RoHS compliant. We can also narrow down results based on life cycle. If you want to look at active parts that are also RoHS compliant, we can click here, and now we narrow the results even further. If we also want to look at parts that happen to have inventory, we can click here and we narrow down the results even further. And if we want to look at the parts that are RoHS compliant and active and have inventory and also are automotive qualified, we can click here and we come down to 8 results that meet all of these criteria. Now, we're going to talk about these basic Silicon Expert fields in detail, but let's clear these filters for a moment. And now we're looking at the full result set of LM317, and the original intention of searching for this term was to find voltage regulators. Now let's say we want to expand our search and not restrict ourselves to only the parts that begin with LM317. If you look at the description column closely, regardless of the supplier, in this case ON Semiconductor, Texas Instruments, and ST Micro, irrespective of the part supplier, these descriptions are very similar. Silicon Expert uses a common structure to describe parts that live in the same category, and uses certain electrical and package specs to describe parts, and they happen to be the most important specs that describe these parts. Now, as you get more and more familiar with these descriptions, you can better utilize and make use of the Silicon Expert fuzzy keyword search. In this case, we can search for positive regulator. Again, Silicon Expert suggests a number of parts that are commonly searched for, but you can just go with these generic keywords. Now make sure that you are looking and using the keyword option and not the part number option, because in this case this is going to be an invalid part number. So we go with the keyword search, and very quickly, although it's a very large data set, which is over 187,000 parts of results, Silicon Expert returns all of the voltage regulators, or at least all of the parts that have positive regulator in their descriptions, and they happen to come from over 100 suppliers in this case. Now, 187,000 parts may be impractical to work with. You can use the filters on the left to narrow down the results even further, but you can still add keywords here to narrow down the results to what you're looking for. So we can add TO220 to select only 3-pin parts that have this package style. We can narrow down the results even further by adding ON Semi, not even the full supplier name, and have the results narrowed down even further. And now we're down to 760,000 parts that are voltage regulators that have this package style from ON Semiconductor. Now, as you may have noticed, results can be quite large. For example, if we search for a manufacturer of connectors such as Samtec, you get over 2.4 million results almost instantly. So there is no limit to the number of results Silicon Expert can provide, and the performance has greatly improved over the past few years. In fact, this has been our theme in 2017, expanding the database, in fact doubling it, while increasing the performance and the speed of the Silicon Expert tools multiple orders of magnitude. The driver, of course, to expanding the database and improving performance is to improve productivity, which is one of the key returns on investment that companies are looking for. Now let's move on to a different product line and also demonstrate the idea of including technical specs in the part description. For example, we can search for diode 70 volts to find all diodes that have a peak reverse voltage of 70 volts. In this case, we have around 4,800 results from 73 different suppliers, as you can see here on the left. Now, 4,000 824 results is not a number that is likely to ever go down. Silicon Expert is not in the business of removing parts from the database. Silicon Expert only adds new parts and existing parts to the database, even parts that have gone obsolete for many years. Silicon Expert maintains them for cross-referencing purposes. Now let's look at the basic fields that Silicon Expert provides before we move on to the part details in depth. CPN is corporate part number, and in case your company integrates your part library into a Silicon Expert system, this field would show the internal part number that represents this manufacturer part number in your part library. We'll talk about approved component lists and approved manufacturer lists later. The part number field is the original manufacturer part number. Silicon Expert maintains original manufacturer part numbers. So if a data sheet has 1,000 parts, then there would be 1,000 part numbers in the Silicon Expert database. They're distinct, and the reason is because in many instances, parts of the family would go obsolete while others remain active. Some parts of the family might be compliant and other parts of the family might not be compliant. And so it makes more sense to manage things at the more granular level. The manufacturer field is the current manufacturer of the part, and that changes over time. Manufacturers go through acquisitions and mergers and splits and rebrands. And so this is the current name of the manufacturer as it exists today, and not necessarily how it was a couple of years ago. When there's an acquired label on a part, this might indicate that there has been a partial or a full acquisition that have taken place between this manufacturer and other manufacturers at some point, and this may have been an acquired part from a different manufacturer. If we click here, it shows that this part has been acquired from ZX in 2008 without changing in the ordering info. The description is the normalized Silicon Expert description, and for every product category there's going to be a standard structure for part descriptions. And as you get more familiar with that, you can again utilize better keyword searches, and you can even upload bill of materials based on part descriptions when you want to qualify new parts for prototyping new bombs, for example. Datasheet is the most recent datasheet that Silicon Expert could put their hands on. For obsolete parts, Silicon Expert is likely to cache the datasheet on the Silicon Expert file repository to ensure that this is always available for our customers. And data sheets of obsolete parts are likely to disappear from their corresponding suppliers' websites at some point, and so it is makes sense to collect and maintain all revisions of these data sheets on the Silicon Expert system if they were to be accessible many years after the part has gone obsolete. The ROAS and lifecycle fields are one of the main and most important fields maintained by Silicon Expert, and they represent the ROAS and European ROAS compliance, the most recent version, which is ROAS 3, and the lifecycle as mentioned by the suppliers. So these two fields come directly from the suppliers. They're not assumptions by Silicon Expert, and they're not assumptions by any of the sellers of the part, but the source has to be the component manufacturer. Now, for parts that have gone obsolete, it makes sense to use Silicon Expert to find alternates and replacements for these parts, and the crosses and options column give you access to the Silicon Expert developed crosses or the supplier recommended options. By crosses, we mean cross-references of parts from one manufacturer to another, and options are recommended part numbers coming from the same component manufacturer. So in this case, this part comes from Diodes Incorporated. Silicon Expert has 97 crosses to this part, and the supplier recommends 5 options that may or may not be currently active. This part, although obsolete, still has one seller, one authorized seller. In this column, we only show authorized and franchised sellers of the part. We do not maintain and show inventory from non-authorized distributors and brokers. And the last column is the predicted years to end of life. This is a forecast, Silicon Expert prediction of how long the part is going to live based on historical trends and shortages and so on, and past obsolescences from this manufacturer. So many different factors go in the years to end of life forecast. And for active parts, there would be a forecast. There could be some comments or some disclaimers that this part was originally expected to live for a certain number of years, but it had lived longer than originally expected. Silicon Expert generally prefers to be on the pessimistic side, so parts would generally live longer than expected rather than live shorter than expected. For obsolete parts, this number is assumed to be 0. Now, let's take a closer look at this part highlighted in yellow. This part happens to be in my part library, which is indicated by the presence of a CPN, or an internal part number, associated with this manufacturer part. This part has recently gone obsolete, and although there is one authorized distributor that may still be supplying the part, it makes sense to keep an eye on this part and maybe find good alternates to avoid risks associated with obsolescence. So we click on the part number here to view more details on this part. The Silicon Expert part details is organized in several groups as seen on the left side of the page. The summary page, which is where you land on by default, includes basic info on the part, including the taxonomy of the part, which is a standard Silicon Expert categorization, and the Silicon Expert description. It also includes other fields, including life cycle, RoHS compliance, conflict minerals, and other fields. The parametric page includes the electric specs of the part as found in the component datasheet. The package page includes everything that has to do with the physical specs and dimensions of the part. Both the parametric and the package pages constitute the technical specifications that Silicon Expert uses to find cross-references for this part. If another part has the same identical specs, then they may be considered form-fit-function replacements or A-crosses. But also, if they differ slightly, they can still be crosses to a certain extent, and there are multiple levels and kinds of crosses, as we'll discuss. Packaging is how the part is shipped from the manufacturer. In this case, it is a tape and reel of 3,000 parts. Manufacturing data includes soldering specs and the lead finish and the plating of the terminals. The environmental category includes multiple regulations and whether the part complies to each one of these regulations. The chemical data shows all of the materials used in different parts of the component and their concentrations and their masses. Conflict minerals is a regulation, but it is so important that it deserves its own data category. Risk analysis is what Silicon Expert does based on all of the history and all of the information available on this part. Silicon Expert comes up with a life cycle risk, a multi-sourcing risk, an inventory risk, and an environmental risk. This part is obsolete, so it is high in life cycle risk. It does have other sources that are potentially have good crosses for this part. It is high in inventory risk because it only has one authorized distributor as of today, and it is low in RoHS risk and environmental risk because it is compliant with the ROAS regulation, and it is compliant with the conflict minerals regulation. Counterfeit risk is based on reports of counterfeit on the part or the product line or parts from this manufacturer in general. And although this part has never been reported to have been counterfeited previously, so 0 reports here, but there has been reports of counterfeit on this manufacturer parts, and there has been multiple reports on rectifiers being counterfeited. And since this part is obsolete and it's time, since market introduction is over 20 years, then the overall risk of being targeted by counterfeiters is high. Design resources includes pinouts and SPICE models if available. Documents includes all of the documents available for this part, including lifecycle documents and data sheets and package documents and so on. And history shows all of the data sheet revisions since the inception of the part. This part has been introduced in 1997, which is the first revision of the data sheet, and last revision of the data sheet was in 2015. Silicon Expert maintains all revisions of a part's data sheets. Also, at the top here, it shows the life cycle transition that it has gone through over the years. Inventory and pricing shows the currently available sellers of the part. Although this part number is a high risk, it does have another alternate from a different source associated with it. So this internal part number, CPN, is associated with 2 AMLs from 2 different sources. If we click on the other part number, we can see that it is active. And if we click on the risk analysis page, it shows that it's medium life cycle risk and is predicted to live for 5 more years. It is low on multi-sourcing risk because it has 2 other active sources, so 2 other alternates and crosses known by Silicon Expert are known to be available and active. And when it comes to inventory risk, this part number is very low risk because it has 11 authorized distributors selling this part. If we click on inventory and pricing, we can see that this part number has a lot of stock from many different authorized sellers. And we scroll down, we can see the trends and changes in pricing and lead time over time. Now, so this part number is not as risky as we initially thought it would be, and this would be more obvious at the bill of materials level, showing one internal part number and multiple parts, and showing the overall risk at the corporate part number to be lower risk. Silicon Expert enables you to find parts parametrically, parts with certain technical specs, which is useful when you need to select and qualify new parts or find alternates to existing ones. There are 3 approaches to finding parts parametrically, either through the product catalog or through the Silicon Expert taxonomy tree or through the Silicon Expert cross by parametric page. One way of finding parts parametrically is to navigate and browse through the Silicon Expert product catalog to find your product line. The product catalog gives you a high-level view of the different kinds of commodities that are currently in the Silicon Expert wider scope. It includes board-mountable and non-board-mountable components. Let's use timers as an example. In this product category, there are over 1,100 parts from 41 different suppliers that you can search within. But you can also focus on a specific manufacturer's parts if needed. The other method is to drill down through the taxonomy tree by first selecting an upper taxonomy, in this case linear parts, and then a middle taxonomy, which leads you to the level of the product line that you can search within parametrically. By default, you land on the standard parametric search, the traditional parametric search, which is a grid of boxes representing the key technical and non-technical attributes of parts in this part category. This product category currently has around 9,400 parts, and you can filter and narrow down results by selecting 0 or more values for each attribute. So we can select 2 channels per chip. With an open collector output type and parts that are active. And now we have a narrowed down result set that we can view. Silicon Expert has recently launched a new parametric search tool with significant performance improvements, but also offers a number of features that enable you to find what you're looking for very effectively and efficiently, especially in product lines with hundreds of thousands or even millions of part numbers. To demonstrate that, let's look at one of the passive product categories. Let's look at capacitors, for example. That's our top-level taxonomy. Our middle-level taxonomy is fixed capacitors. And multi-layer ceramic capacitors have over 2 million part numbers. We can navigate to the new parametric search from here. At the top you can see all of the product attributes related to this product category horizontally, and at the bottom are the top results based on my current parametric selections. Some features have the nozzle icon underneath them, and that indicates that they're numerical values, and you can filter and narrow down results by a numerical range. Let's look at one of the key features, the capacitance value itself. When we click on the nozzle, we see all of the available capacitance values throughout the entire Silicon Expert database for multi-layer ceramic capacitors. They're sorted in order, so the smallest values appear at the top and the largest values appear at the bottom. Next to each value is the number of parts available that have this capacitance value. So that gives you an idea on how common certain values are. For example, 0.16 picofarads is much more common than 0.17 picofarads, and this is useful when selecting new part numbers. It is always good to select values that are common and to not run into obsolescence issues down the line. So 0.16 picofarads is one that would potentially have more sources and would be less risky in the future. Let's say we want to look at parts that have a range of 0.13 to 0.16 picofarads of capacitance. We can do that by typing 0.13p to 0.16p, and that would include only the parts that fall within that numerical range. Let's look at another example. We can also have a minimal value or a maximum value to have an unbounded upper limit or an unbounded lower limit. We can also select parts and have numerical multipliers different than the ones shown here. For example, we can look at 0.32 microfarads to 0.35 microfarads, and that would limit the results to only the parts having these numerical values. But we can also replace the 0.35 micros to 350 nanos, giving the exact same result. So you can change and use your own numerical multipliers when doing numerical range search. We can click on apply, and this would filter down the results to only 14,000 parts that have capacitance values that fall within this numerical range. We can use other filters to narrow down the results even further. Let's say we want to look at capacitors whose mounting type are through-hole. On the left-hand side, there are a number of features that can be used to restrict results to parts that have certain qualifications. For example, we can restrict results to parts that are automotive qualified, and we can restrict results to parts that are REACH compliant. We can also restrict results to parts that have available inventory at authorized distributors. So we narrowed down the result from over 2 million capacitor part numbers on Silicon Expert to 45 results that you can work with. These results can be downloaded in Excel spreadsheets. This enables you to export this data and work with the different kinds of parts that meet these specs externally. This includes the main basic Silicon Expert fields as well as the technical specs of each one of these parts. This report, however, does not include all of the data available on each one of these parts. There's another way to view and focus on a number of parts and comparing them side by side throughout the entire data categories that Silicon Expert maintains. You can select a number of parts, let's say 2 parts from AVX and 2 parts from TDK, and compare selected parts. You can compare up to 8 different part numbers, and this takes you to a view where you can view these parts side by side and comparing them throughout all of the data categories that Silicon Expert maintains. So that includes the summary view, and the parametric data view. Wherever these parts have common values, they would share the same cell. If they have different values, such as in this case the maximum operating temperature, they would have different cells. So this part has a maximum operating temperature of 150. These 2 parts have maximum operating temperature of 125, and this part has a maximum operating temperature as 150 Celsius. And this can be downloaded in Excel spreadsheet as well. Comparing these 4 different parts throughout the different data categories that Silicon Expert maintains, including the summary, parametric, package, manufacturing, and so on.